Our next speaker is going to speak himself on the topic of training for success on and off the track. And Andrew Mclean is an individual with an outstanding knowledge and understanding of the thoroughbred's brain, mannerisms and overall psychology and physiology, and I'm sure you'll just love hearing from Andrew because we had a Zoom meeting and you could talk for hours to this fella. He's written many research papers on equine learning and training, is an expert on animal welfare. Please make welcome our second keynote speaker, Andrew Mclean. Welcome, Andrew.
It's really a big pleasure to be here, not only because I'm talking about horses, but also because for me it's the first time I've actually spoken to an audience in 3 years after lockdown and COVID. It's a great honour to talk about the aftercare of racehorses because it is an important part of their life when you think of the amount of time spent after racing. So what I want to do is have a look at some important aspects of welfare to do with what we call mental security. And let's see if I can, here we go. So mental security in the horse it's the same thing as it is for humans. In terms of horses, it's not only valuable for themselves, but it's also valuable for us to give horses as good a mental security as we can, because it enables us to get the very best out of them. Obviously, if we provide those things, then whatever we train them to do, we can possibly get them the very best that they ever can do on the racetrack, or whatever we do, and in their life after racing. So what it basically means is that our training needs to be fundamentally clear to the horse, and that's not always easy because often we have, there's a traditional narrative about horse training, and very often we get basically a bit confused and in a kind of a turmoil about all the different narratives that we hear about in training. So I want to get down to the really raw basics of what we do to horses in training, in that we teach them to stop and go and turn and things like that. So in this presentation I'm going to talk about training, but also I'm going to finish off talking a little bit about management. So I guess I can't really go further than to mention the flight response, and that's something that we have brought back into the thoroughbred because it helps us in racing. It also makes them much more sensitive and reactive. In the horse itself, unlike many other domestic animals or domestic ungulates, the horse needed a flight response anyway because it was a creature of the open grassland where you're always visible to your predators. And so what we've done in selective breeding for racing is we've enhanced that so that the horse is even more reactive. And that actually makes the thoroughbred such a great horse for horse sports in a life after racing. What is important to recognise in the flight response is that it's about escape learning for the horse. And what makes him remember it is how fast and how far his legs went. And it's really as simple as that. If his legs move very fast, but he's stationary, for example, he gets something bad happens and he's in a crush, he will still have some flight response embedded. If he gets to escape further, he's going to have it even further embedded. So in other words, if the horse shies and he runs 10 metres, it's going to be more deeply embedded. And in scientific terms, we call that long-term potentiation. And that's what escape learning does. It really embeds these pathways of learning. So part of this, I'm trying to also include in my talk about what we can do as trainers in the life after racing and during racing as well, and even before racing, is teach horses to have good reactions to our signals of stop and go, because when horses pull against us, as in this picture, and that's really very common, it's more common in thoroughbreds because they are goers, is we need to teach them to learn the balance of stop and go so that when we go woo and they stay at our speed. And that really makes a huge difference. And also teaching horses to stay still till told otherwise, and that's again through the really clear training of just simply stop and go, acceleration, deceleration, and all of the facets within that are used in the highest levels of sport in terms of acceleration and deceleration, live within those basic responses, such as lengthening the movement without necessarily quickening the legs without lengthening, shortening the steps without slowing, and slowing the steps without shortening. All of these things are valuable for the horse after racing, and in my opinion, very valuable in racing too, if we had a signal for example, lengthening, because most horses, after the home turn, they win races by lengthening their stride. Perhaps the one that didn't, that is the most outstanding, was Winx, and what she did was accelerate, and her beats per minute was something like 150, 160 beats per minute, which is ridiculously fast. So if we know that, it probably even helps us in breeding. But anyway, I'm not going down that track. I'm still sticking with this mental security thing. In animals, we generally think of mental security in terms of predictability and controllability. Animals need signals, as we do, to make our lives safe and easy. You know, red lights always mean stop, green lights mean go, and it's not like it's tricky, it just works for us. And if you think that's really an allegory of how life really is for all animals, there are signals that mean good things and things that mean not so good things. Basically, if a signal always leads to response, in other words, if we're consistent as trainers, animals are calm and confident. If a signal never leads to a response, which of course means it's not a signal anymore, they're still calm because they don't bother to react. The problem is when signals only sometimes mean something and not always, and that's really about being consistent. The sorts of things that it shows up when horses are mentally insecure is that, you know, where they become anxious, they try and escape, or they may become aggressive, or they may even become apathetic. Also, it's essential that the horse is clear in training in hand as well as under saddle, so we should never underestimate the importance of good in-hand work, because there is some considerable research now. I know of 2 papers that show that if the horse is really clear with all the signals in hand, it's more likely to be clearer under saddle, and vice versa. So they work in tandem. There's another, and this is just a basic point, there are quite a few of them, but I've just distilled it down to a couple, and that is that operant conditioning should be trained before classical conditioning. All that means is that pressure release training should be instilled in the horse's brain before we start teaching them classically conditioned signals such as the voice. It's good to have horses on voice commands, but you can't enforce them, and the boundaries collapse after a period of time. So the sorts of things that are involved in training the basics are teaching horses to go forward from lead rein pressures, and the way to test that is, does the horse do it without you moving your feet? Because if he sees you moving your feet, that's predictive, and that's also classical conditioning, and the wheels can fall off. So having really clear reactions to pressure, that the horse goes forward, if you push your hand forward and the horse stops when you bring it back, and he steps back if he's standing still if you do it again towards his shoulders. So those things are really important. They provide the behavioural boundaries and give the horse mental security. In other words, predictability and controllability. So as many horsemen have said, and this has been not something that I invented, all the great horsemen of the world, including those in North America, Monty Roberts, Pat Pirelli, all of them talk about controlling the horse's legs. And we should never forget that, because often we get very concerned about what happens on the top floor, in other words, the head and neck, rather than thinking about controlling the legs. If you control the legs, you can control so much more of the head and neck. And so, again, we need to teach the horse that the boundaries of pressures of lead rein signals for forward and stop and turn under saddle, but also teach the horse that various levels of pressure correspond with various requests, so that if we push our hand forward a bit stronger, the horse would maybe even trot. If he is trotting in hand and we go woo with a slightly stronger pressure than a small one, we might expect him to immediately halt or to go back to walk. So there are these pressure variations that are implicit in all good horsemen, but they often don't know that that's exactly what they're doing. What my job has been in my life is to break these things down into small into small parts and then build them up again in the horse in my work as a behavioural retrainer and behaviour modification at the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre for 25 odd years. So teaching the horse to, first of all, go forward, test out how he goes forward from the lead rein pressure. Then you can also add the voice command once he's good at it. That's no problem. Add as many other signals, but just remember the signals of pressure are fundamental. And then also teaching the horse to step backwards is really valuable for racehorse trainers to do. It's dead easy. All you need to do is to give the pressure. And if the horse just shortens his neck and tucks his nose in, don't release the pressure for that, because then you're teaching the wrong thing. It's all learned from the release of pressure when he does it. So teach the horse to step back from a light pressure. And once you've got those things, you've also taught him some brakes. And that's one thing that we do need to do with horses off the track, because quite often their brakes aren't that good because they don't need them. You know, a horse slows down from racing. Maybe it takes 200 metres, and it's not a problem. But when it comes to retraining, that's what is important when we're trying to train the horse for jumping or dressage or eventing or anything. We don't want it to take 200 metres. We want to be able to just close our fingers and the horse immediately will either shorten or slow or whatever it is you've trained him to do. Stepping backwards also works because the muscles that the horse uses to step backwards, which are 3 sets of pectoral muscles in the horse's chest that you can see twang when he does step backwards, they are the muscles he also uses for slowing down at every single speed. When the horse is going faster than walk, they're not the only muscles because he uses his back legs as well. But in walk, he only does it with his pectoral muscles. And so therefore it trains various elements of stop and deceleration when we train him to step back. So when we do that, we see that the rider or the handler gives the pressure, and eventually the horse learns to do many steps back. In the beginning, we just teach him to do a single step back, and we reward him for that and give him a scratch and tell him how good he is. And then we start to ask for more steps as well. We also teach the horse to stand still, as I mentioned earlier, and that's really valuable. We call that park, but you can call it whatever you like. But teaching the horse to just stay still, which basically means that he doesn't follow your legs every time without a command. Now, the command could be a voice command, or it could simply be that in the absence of any command, he stays doing what you asked him to do, and that is to stay still. So there are quite a few approaches that learning theory offers. Learning theory is the sort of scientific realm of the knowledge of learning processes in animals. And so basically we teach him to stay there until he's asked otherwise. And of course in the beginning we don't teach him to stay still for very long. But it is really valuable, this teaching the horse to stand still and park. And it takes no time, and the payoffs are enormous all the way through his life because he's much calmer when you do. It's really amazing how calm it makes him. So in this one, we walk away from the horse, and we do it in many different ways. We not only walk backwards, because they're so good at classical conditioning, we have to test out every possible way we walk away from the horse. So not only in that direction, but also facing forward, because often that's a trigger for the horse to move. And we teach him, no, you wait till I tell you to. It doesn't take long, because all you have to do is when he walks forward is just step him back to where he was, because you've already taught him to step back. So these are really, to me, really fundamental things. And you can run away from him, you can do a curved line, all of those things. But it helps keep the horse mentally secure. Also teaching the horse to lower his head. Now that, in the early days of researching this, some people thought this was a learned, it was just a learned association that when his head was down he was calmer. But it's actually not, it's physiological. Because all long-necked animals have these carotid bodies in the carotid artery, and within those carotid bodies are these smaller cells called baroreceptors, baro meaning pressure as in barometer. And when a long-necked animal puts his head low, his blood pressure drops almost straight away, and then as a consequence the heart rate is also likely to go down. So having a horse with a low head, you can see they start to get really sleepy when their head's down, and it's been down for a few seconds because their blinks become really slow. It makes them sleepy. So it's really valuable to give the horse a calmer feeling in doing various things like shoeing or whatever you clipping or whatever you want to do to a horse. If you teach him to have his head lower, it can make such a big difference because it also puts him in a calm space. And so under saddle, the same kinds of things. We teach him all of those kinds of transitions, and I'm not going through it again because it's the same as in hand, essentially the reactions you want, but we do it from our legs and reins under saddle. And this again is important in the horse in breaking in. That's what good breakers do. And they, as I said, they implicitly know it without explicitly knowing it always, but they do it really well like that. Trainers and after training all need to check those things. But one thing that we find is that in many cases horses off the track are not that good at turning. In other words, turning means the forelegs go laterally so that he changes direction, because the horse can also change direction by turning his hind legs. But in terms of the forelegs, the horse will typically fall in one direction on one shoulder or the other, and in equestrian terms we call that crookedness, that it makes him really crooked and bent, and that predisposes him to go one way or the other. And they do it in racing too, which is why lugging bits are used primarily, and lugging bits as a way of keeping the horse straight. But the problem with the lugging bit is that it may have a slightly decelerating effect. So it's much better if we can train the horse to turn, and that's really what I'm doing, showing in this video, just basically teaching the horse to do a wiggly line by using pressure on one rein only, nothing else, and check that he goes to the left, and then give him a rest. Now open your right rein, and he goes to the right. So it's not a very big video, but same thing. You're just teaching him to do curves. Now I spent a fair bit of time with Peter Hayes before he died in the plane crash. He was Australia's leading trainer for some months after he died. And he was a really outstanding human being as well as trainer. And that's the one thing he said when I was helping him with horses that had trouble loading in the barriers, in the starting gates. He said, "What else could you do that would help me here?" And I said, "Well, you could remove a lot of those lugging bits if you taught the horses to turn. And all you've got to do is, in training, is get the jockeys, while they're at the trot, just to do turns and check them each day that the horse maintains his understanding of what a turn is. You can really help avoid those things." And the same thing with tongue ties. That, I know that's a little bit of a political hot potato, rather like whips, but my perception of it is that we can avoid them by teaching horses really clear decelerating signals, because that's what I've done in the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre, is that I found that all the horses that needed them don't have very good brakes. So you teach them to slow down, but from the lightest of aids, so it becomes real implicit knowledge, like whispering, and make sure that when you give your reins back, he doesn't just run off for no good reason. He waits until you say go with your legs, and it makes an event horse a better horse as well when we can do that. And of course we need some level of contact in various sports like show jump if we want the horse to take us a little bit to the fence. That's all good and well, and that's true, but we just don't need them to go too far where they just basically run off and they're just out of control and too strong. So that's one thing. And whips are so often seen around the world, as because we're seen by the world in racing, social licenses are a really big thing, and people care about horses so much. Interesting to note that I was in New Zealand last week, but I saw my wife saw it on Facebook, that there was a really awful accident in Tasmania with 5 horses killed, and I think the people were injured. One was very badly injured. But the comments on Facebook were all, well, not all, but nearly always about the horse. Oh, that's a terrible tragedy. This is the world we live in, you see. There were very few comments about how terrible they feel for the people that were badly injured. So that is what social license is all about. But nonetheless, one of the things we know about whips is that they can be used well. I'm not against the whip at all. And that's where, when I've talked about, people say, well, you're a hypocrite because I've seen you with a whip. It's how you use it. So if you can teach the horse to accelerate, and when he does, stop using the whip. So one of the problems of the whip is just simply that if the horse can't go faster and can't respond to the whip, that can decrease his mental security. So it's worth thinking about those sorts of things. One thing we do know from research, which is also quite interesting, is that whips tend to increase the speed of the legs, but they don't increase the stride length. So, there's some interesting things to ponder in that. And now heading towards management, I was a co-author in the latest model of animal welfare called the 5 domains model, and one of the things that got me involved was this first bullet point, behavioural interactions, because it didn't exist in the earlier models. And I said it's really important because people can mess up animals by getting their training wrong. Not only horses, but also dogs and also elephants. I also train elephants in Southeast Asia. It's exactly the same thing. That we need to get that right and teach people how to do it well, which is, again, the most important aspect is how you use pressure release. Teaching people to do that really well goes a long way. So these hardwired needs in the horse, they're not just something that the horse wants, they're actually wired to do it. So it's something that the horse badly needs. And if we restrict them, we see problems like wind sucking, weaving, box walking and those things, because they are very much connected with those things. So for example, I've just listed 4, but they're to me the big 4. They're the big pillars. The others are nowhere near as important, I don't think, in terms of the research. The deprivation of these things, the poor behavioural interactions, foraging, exercise, movement and socialisation, is heavily associated with stereotypical behaviours like wind-sucking, weaving, box walking, etc. So just going through them, the foraging, of course, is about the horse's drive to munch for about 13 odd hours a day, which is what they've evolved for. Now, I know in racing we can't do that because they'll be enormous. But what you can do is give them access to the need to munch by fiddling and using slow feeders. Make it really difficult. But just doing something with their mouth reduces the amount of stereotypical behaviours. And that's where slow feeders can really help, where the horse is never going to get fat during eating hay because he just can't get enough of it, but it's good for his mind. Exercise and movement, well, that's an important thing. Not such a big card for me to play here because we live in Australia and many people from Asia as well as in the USA, where it's not always freezing in the winter. But when I do these talks in Finland, it's vitally important because then they wonder why the horse is going off its trolley when it's let out of the stable and it's been in there and they've arrived for their 1 lesson per week. So it's important mentally for horses to have that. But moving on to socialisation, that is the other big one. We do know now that it's not enough for horses to just see each other. It helps them enormously if they can just touch each other. And so I think the new things that we'll see in the modern architecture of stabling will be giving horses access to be able to touch each other and do a bit of grooming. Of course, it means you've got to arrange the horses with those beside them that they do like, but it does pay off. I did a big project with the Manchester Mounted Police, which is one of the biggest mounted police units in the United Kingdom, if not the biggest. And I suggested to them, because we'd done all the training and the horses were really well behaved out on patrol, and I'd been going back every year for a few years, but there were a few things that weren't still going that well. Some of the horses were really timid and not brave in the outside world, and I said, why don't you give it a shot? Just take down the bars of a few of the stables and see how those horses compare and take notes, and do tell me if it doesn't work, because I want to know bad news as well. And they decided to take down all the bars. So all the horses had access to each other. And the stories they came back with were, in the first week it was a bit noisy, and there were the odd bite, but after that, the horses were much braver out on patrol. And these are the things I'm talking about, that there is a lot of incentive for us as trainers to do the best we can and to recognise that horses have these needs that, well, socialisation's a need that we have too. You know, isolation's the single most important deprivation in humans that's associated with disease. So it's just the same for horses as a social animal. I think that social aspect is the thing that draws us both together. And that diagram on the right there is just to show that, you know, we can separate what I call care, which is physiological needs that vets provide and everyone else, but there's also the welfare aspects that's the ethological need of the horse's behaviours, and that to me is the future. So in terms of stable design, this is on the left-hand side, this is the original bars at the Manchester Mounted Police, and that's what it looked like afterwards with the bars down. So I'm certainly not advocating we take everything down at this point because it could be really chaotic, but just giving them access. And Luke Jones has also been working with me. He's an architect in South Australia, and he's already designed these sorts of stables that are really quite elegant, but give the horse a little bit more social life. And I just want to finish with Tom Roberts' words. He was a great mentor for me and an outstanding horseman and an extremely nice person as well. And he said, "If you're fond of a horse and wish to do him a real favour, train him well. Teach him good manners, good habits, both in the stable and under the saddle. You never need worry about the future of such a horse if for any reason you may have to part with him. You assure him of friends wherever he goes. Perhaps the greatest kindness you can do any horse is to educate him well." And so thank you very much. Thanks for listening.